Charlie Chaplin's The Great Dictator. I would... Oh, there's a spotlight. Oh.
Can you put one of the house lights on?
Which one?
The inner one, the middle one.
Okay.
I know that the film club in Little Wells is run very much on a you ask for it, we'll play it, and The Great Dictator and Chaplin was what people have requested the most, and I know that it took a lot of work and a lot of negotiation to be able to have the rights to show The Great Dictator tonight, so I'd just like to give everybody okay, I'm just getting, they've very kindly let me come back and speak again. I'm just getting into this. I know some of you may have heard me speak either on Manhattan or Halloween, and thinking, oh my God, it's him again. But I promise you, very quick, it's just a few notes. So I'll start. No event in the history of the screen has ever been anticipated with more hopeful excitement than the premiere of this film. No picture ever made has promised more momentous consequences. This begins the New York Times original review for Charlie Chaplin's The Great Dictator, which a scathing satire on the rise of the Third Reich, which premiered at 2 LA theatres the evening before, October the 15th, 1940. A precarious, uncertain time in US history, for whilst England and France had been at war for over a year, America was still at peace with Germany. Legend has it that 3 years previously, 1937, casually during a conversation with film producer Alexander Korda mentioned to Chaplin his aesthetic similarity to Hitler. Chaplin and Hitler were born 4 days apart in April 1889. Chaplin, already concerned in what he perceived to be America's complacency towards the rise of fascism, announced production of The Great Dictator a few weeks later, also stating that The Great Dictator would be his first talkie. So therefore the rather hyperbolic opening from the New York Times can be forgiven because this was quite momentous. Sound had come to movies 12 years previously, and it was initially, as we all know, and naively dismissed as a gimmick, a fad, something that wouldn't catch on. But the silent movie was quite literally history, and within 4 years, all of America's cinematic output had synchronised sound. The majority of silent film stars' biggest stars were finished right along with it, including his nearest comedy rivals, Harold Lloyd, Buster Keaton. None of them made the transition to sound movies. Chaplin is unique in that he not only survived the segue, he had no need to utilise the new technology because audiences still packed his movies in. So whilst Modern Times in '36 had a synced piano soundtrack and his voice was heard over the end credits, it was still essentially a silent movie. People would still go and see a silent movie as long as his name was above the title. Charlie Chaplin, Sir Charles Chaplin, forever immortalised as the Little Tramp, who makes an appearance here as the Little Barber. Chaplin is often called the Great Communicator because through mind, through body language, through expression, here through dance most classically, even his early films are not overly reliant on intertitles because you don't need words to understand, and this is why the early films of Chaplin bewitch children today. A friend of mine, small little boy, he came on the TV doing one of his with the cane. I said, oh look, Charlie Chaplin, he was mesmerised, much more so than he probably was during Disney Pixar's Cars. By The Great Dictator, Chaplin had been one of the world's biggest entertainers for over 25 years, but it would be very foolish to say he was universally liked. The Little Tramp, who raised the spirits during the Great War and then kept the nation's spirits up during the Depression, was a very different entity than Charles Chaplin himself and the Little Tramps who audiences paid to see. He was an outspoken critic of the politics of the country who had made him very rich, so therefore he was seen by a lot of people as traitorous. And researching Chaplin, you note many analogies to that other great UK to US expat who would forever change the shape of American cinema, Alfred Hitchcock. Both were geniuses and both knew it, hence against the inevitable egomania, which in Chaplin's case allegedly expressed itself through temper tantrums, fierce temper tantrums. Excuse me. Bloody thing. Sorry. Neither gave easy attribution to their work colleagues. If people like to think that their masterpieces were their work and theirs alone, that was fine by them. Sorry, I don't know what this is doing. Both were perfectionists with reputations for difficult onset behaviour. Both had cantankerous relationships with their contemporaries in the media. But Hitchcock was never publicly political. Chaplin was vociferously so, which would land him in a lot of hot water in his life. Hitchcock, who delighted in exploring the psychosexual on-screen, had very little interest in the activity off-screen, something that can't be said for Chaplin, who was involved in sex scandal after sex scandal throughout his life. Most famously, he was found to be having an affair with 15-year-old Lita Gray in 1918. The studio arranged a shotgun wedding. Gray did bear him 2 kids, but it was of course a disastrous marriage. And shortly after they were separated, Nabokov immortalised her forever by naming Lolita after her. And of course, if you put in Charles Chaplin yacht shooting, you'll read about one of Hollywood's greatest subterfuges of all time, which I highly recommend reading about. When production began on The Great Dictator, Charles Chaplin's films were already banned in Germany, a misconception shared by many the world over that Chaplin was Jewish. Chaplin both denied and proclaimed his Jewish lineage. He actually wasn't Jewish. Lots of people have debated that over the years. He wasn't, but he stopped denying it by the 40s. If people thought he was a Jew, that was fine by him, which was very commendable considering the times. When shooting on The Great Dictator commenced, Hitler's culture secretary contacted Joseph Breen, America's chief censor, and asked him to shut down production. Breen refused to do so. Hitler allegedly imported a print from Portugal and watched it twice. His architect later told the press that Hitler grudgingly admitted that Chaplin had got the impersonation spot on. Whilst aware of Nazi persecution towards the Jews, Chaplin was as ignorant as everybody else to the true horrors that were unfolding in the occupied nations. And barely half a decade later, when we were learning the chilling truth, The Great Dictator was an immediate relic, an uncomfortable reminder of an ignorance lost. What was once considered so subversive, so outrageous, now seemed offensive in its innocence. The humour could be forgiven, but there was a sense that the film should be put to bed, forgotten. Asked after the war if he would have gone ahead with The Great Dictator as it was, had he known of the Holocaust, Chaplin's response was obvious. Of course not. But The Great Dictator survives largely because it so accurately and pinpoints the zeitgeist. It has forever shifting meanings, different resonances with each decade, for each successive generation. In 1952, promoting Limelight in Europe, the first time he left the US since he'd taken up residence there, he refused to allow Limelight to be shown unless the ban on The Great Dictator was lifted in Germany, and that was shown first. When Hitler returned back to the US, he wasn't allowed back in. He was the head target of the House of Un-American Activities as communist. So he took exile to Switzerland with Una O'Neill, his wife, who bore him 8 children. He returned to the US once more to scoop a Lifetime Achievement Academy Award in 1972, and he passed away on Christmas Day 1977 at the age of 88. In finishing, let's return to the New York Times. Every masterpiece has its flaws. The ones that the critics accused The Great Dictator of at the time pretty much hold up today, but they're for your own finding, of course. The New York Times finished on this. Suddenly one perceives in bold relief the things that make The Great Dictator great. The courage and faith and surpassing love for mankind, which was in the heart